Night settled like a suffocating blanket, leaving the world outside my car windows a smear of black. I remember the moment I pulled up to the inn's gravel lot, the heavy moon hanging unnaturally low, the wind hissing through the nearby pines. An inexplicable chill ran down my spine before I even stepped out onto the crumbling pathway. Something felt off, like I was intruding on a place that did not want me there. My business trip had already drained my energy, and I was desperate for a bed, any bed, to collapse onto. The inn seemed ordinary enough at first glance. A sagging wooden facade, a dim lantern by the entrance. A caretaker informed me that every room inside was occupied, but there was a small chalet out back, usually reserved for overflow guests or last-minute travelers. He mentioned it was sparse, but should suffice for one night. His tone sounded hesitant, though he never said outright that I should avoid it. Something in his eyes hinted that the chalet had a reputation, but I was too tired to care. I nodded, thanked him under my breath, and made my way across the yard, flashlight in hand. The chalet was a humble structure, single-roomed, with peeling paint and shutters hanging slightly askew. It reminded me of an old storage shed someone tried to convert into a guest room. When I opened the creaking door, a stale odor greeted me, as if the place hadn't been aired out in months. The interior was cramped, featuring a narrow cot, a small table, and a solitary oil lamp in one corner. My breath caught in my throat, partly from fatigue and partly from an unshakable sense of unease. Still, I told myself I just needed some sleep. The caretaker had said I could settle in right away, so I latched the door behind me, set down my suitcase, and switched on a small electric lamp I'd brought along. The single overhead bulb flickered uncertainly, casting jittery shadows on the walls. An hour later, darkness enveloped the world beyond the window. I tried reading a paperback I'd stuffed into my luggage, but I kept glancing up at the corners of the room, imagining shapes moving just at the edge of my vision. My heart thudded in my ears, loud enough to mask the insect chirps outside. The temperature dropped quickly, turning my breath into faint clouds. I decided it was time to try sleeping. Dressed in my rumpled clothes, I draped a thin blanket over myself and closed my eyes. I don't know how long I lay there, drifting in and out of restless dozing, when I first heard it. An abrasive rasping that seemed to come from the exterior wall closest to my bed. My eyes snapped open, and my pulse hammered violently against my ribcage. It almost sounded like someone was scraping something sharp across the wood, with a deliberate slowness that made my skin crawl. My mouth went dry as I held my breath and waited to see if it would stop. But it didn't. Instead, the sound circled around the chalet, pausing occasionally before resuming in soft, agonizing arcs. Every muscle in my body tensed. I forced myself to stand, my legs threatening to buckle beneath me. My hand trembled when I reached for the doorknob. For a moment, I considered throwing the door wide open, confronting whoever or whatever was making that noise. Courage faltered in the face of uncertainty, and I hesitated. Finally, I exhaled, twisted the knob, and pulled the door toward me. The night outside was thick with shadows. My small lamp's glow barely penetrated beyond the threshold. I squinted into the darkness, leaning forward, trying to spot any movement among the skeletal silhouettes of trees. There was nothing. Only the chilling wind moaned between the trunks and the scuttling of branches against one another. I stepped back, my heart still pounding, and locked the door once again. For several minutes, I stood in the center of the chalet, focusing on my breathing and telling myself there had to be a rational explanation. Maybe loose branches scraping the walls. Perhaps a stray animal. My mind latched onto every mundane possibility, clinging to normalcy. Eventually, I sat on the cot again, still fully awake and alert. The slow, deliberate scratching did not return, and I began to relax, though my body still hummed with residual adrenaline. Just as my eyelids grew heavy, I heard another sound, a faint metallic click. My breath caught. Then the doorknob rattled from the outside, almost imperceptibly at first. My pulse accelerated, and I felt droplets of sweat form along my hairline. I crept toward the door. The knob turned more insistently, like a hand testing its strength. Instinctively, I grabbed my side of the knob, holding it in place to prevent it from turning any further. My palms slicked with sweat, and I stood there, frozen, fighting the silent force that pressed from the other side. My mind raced with questions. Was someone outside, playing tricks on me? I tried to call out, but my throat tightened, and only a weak rasp escaped my lips. For what felt like hours, though it must have been mere seconds, I wrestled with that doorknob, my breath coming in ragged bursts. Finally, the pressure subsided. The knob stopped turning, and the presence behind the door retreated. I stood there, chest heaving, until the panic subsided enough for me to regain some composure. Even then, I didn't dare open the door again. Instead, I pushed a small table and the rickety chair against it, barricading myself inside. Sleep was impossible. I spent the rest of the night on edge, flinching at every rustle of wind or creak of the wood beneath my feet. My thoughts spiraled into paranoia, envisioning shapes peering in through the shutters, or inhuman figures lurking just out of sight. Each time I caught my reflection in the dusty window, my heart lurched, momentarily confusing my own image for something else. I tried to rationalize, telling myself the caretaker would have warned me if there was real danger. Yet the only explanation that made sense was that something wanted to get inside. The hours dragged on, and my sanity felt like it was fraying with each tick of the clock. Eventually, the faint glow of dawn replaced the oppressive darkness. Despite my exhaustion, relief swept over me when I finally mustered the courage to slide the makeshift barricade aside and open the door. Outside, the morning air was cold and still. Dew clung to the tall grass, and the sky blazed with the first streaks of sunlight. I stepped around to inspect the walls. My stomach clenched at the sight. Deep gouges in the wood, arranged in long, ragged patterns. They looked more like claw marks than anything a human might have made. My pulse throbbed in my temples, and a surge of nauseating fear washed over me. I felt an overwhelming urge to flee, to leave that chalet and never look back. Gathering my belongings took only seconds. With shaking hands, I tossed them into my car. My mind kept replaying the relentless scraping, the twisting doorknob, the unearthly stillness when I'd looked outside. It all felt both impossible and undeniably real. As I drove away, I couldn't stop checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see some silhouette standing in the yard, watching me go. By the time I pulled onto the highway, my shirt was damp with sweat, and my eyes stung from lack of sleep. Yet a question still gnawed at me. Had I truly encountered something supernatural? Or was my exhaustion and anxiety playing tricks on my mind? The marks on the wood were real enough, but how they got there remained a mystery. Even now, recalling the sound of those scratches makes my heart pound, as if I'm right back in that tiny chalet, waiting for the next knock on the door. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake up convinced I hear it again. That slow, careful scraping just outside my walls. reminding me that some nights, what we fear might be more real than we dare to imagine. I remember the night began with an unsettling hush that clung to the corridors like a lingering mist. The overhead fluorescents buzzed softly, casting harsh white light on the scuffed linoleum floors. Each footstep I took seemed too loud, too intrusive, echoing down the empty hallway. From the moment I stepped onto that graveyard shift, my skin prickled with a sense of foreboding. It was as though the walls themselves were silently observing me, waiting for some unspoken signal to close in. I had worked as a nurse in this clinical center for years, and I knew its every quirk. The faulty elevator at the far end, the flickering light by the supply closet, the unnerving hush of certain unoccupied rooms. Still, that night felt different. My breath was shallow, even before I felt anything wrong, as if my body anticipated a threat my mind refused to name. Sometime around midnight, I found myself in the east corridor, the one that always felt colder than the others. It was dimmer here because one of the overhead fixtures had been sputtering for weeks, never fully fixed by maintenance. The result was a strobe-like flicker that made it seem as if something might be moving in the corners of my vision. I kept glancing around, convinced I was imagining shapes that weren't there. My heart thudded in my chest. My palms were damp, and I wiped them on my scrubs to keep from shaking too visibly. Then, out of nowhere, I felt an invisible force crash down on my shoulders. The weight was impossible to rationalize. It was as if a giant hand pressed me toward the floor. My knees buckled, and my arms hung uselessly at my sides. My mouth went dry, and my tongue stuck to the roof, refusing to form words. There was a moment of sheer, unadulterated panic as I realized I could neither speak nor move. My arms felt numb, like dead weight attached to my torso. It lasted mere seconds, but in that sliver of time, my heart nearly pounded out of my chest. I thought I felt the linoleum tiles tilting beneath me, threatening to swallow me whole. When the crushing force finally lifted, I stumbled, gasping for air. Sweat poured down my temples, and my uniform clung to my back. I looked around the corridor, expecting to see someone, anyone, standing there. But the hallway was empty. The flickering light overhead seemed to pulse in time with my ragged breath. No signs of intrusion, no evidence that I wasn't alone. I tried to convince myself it was exhaustion, maybe a panic attack. Yet my body remained on high alert, eyes darting, ears straining for the slightest sound. I carried that sensation of being shoved the rest of my shift, though the actual paralysis didn't happen again for a while. I was terrified to walk the corridors alone, but I had no choice. I had rounds to do, vitals to check, routine tasks that suddenly felt surreal and menacing. Each step I took felt unsteady, as if the floor might lurch again at any moment. My breathing never fully calmed. Around 2 a.m, a coworker noticed my pallor. She asked if I was feeling all right. I muttered something about being tired and changed the subject quickly. I couldn't bring myself to share what had happened. How do you explain an invisible force pinning you to the ground without sounding unhinged? She shrugged sympathetically and walked away, leaving me with the persistent hum of fluorescent lights and my own spiraling thoughts. I pressed on, returning to the corridor that had nearly brought me to my knees. My heart hammered so loudly, I could almost hear it echoing. Each overhead light seemed to illuminate a pocket of emptiness, but it felt like that emptiness was alive. I could hear my own footsteps scuffing along the tiles, and for a fleeting moment, I heard something else, an extra set of steps that fell silent whenever I stopped to listen. I turned abruptly, scanning the corridor. No one, just that flickering light again, creating the illusion of shifting shadows. The walls felt closer every time I looked up. Doors to patient rooms remained closed, but I couldn't shake the notion that eyes watched me from behind them. My neck tingled as if something hovered inches away from my skin. Occasionally, I'd catch a faint whisper, my name, or maybe just the squeak of old pipes. I forced myself to keep moving, but my legs trembled with each step. My mouth was so dry I could hardly swallow. By 3 o'clock, I was certain the clinic had turned hostile. Soft moans, perhaps a patient in discomfort, drifted through the halls, yet they sounded distorted, as if carried by a wind that didn't exist. My scrubs felt constricting, and my chest tightened as I struggled to take a full breath. The flickering light overhead grew more erratic, plunging the corridor into rhythmic, stuttering darkness. Every time the light vanished, my heart seized, convinced that when it returned, I'd see a figure standing right in front of me. I checked the last patient room in that wing, scanning the vitals quickly, trying to ignore the creeping sensation that the walls were pulsing in and out. When I exited, the corridor was deserted, except for a gurney left near the supply closet. I felt a chill slither down my spine as I approached it. The hallway smelled faintly of antiseptic and something metallic, like old blood. An instinct told me to hurry, to retreat to the nurse's station where the lights were brighter. But I couldn't help glancing at that gurney, half expecting something to sit up from it. Suddenly, it happened again. The same invisible weight slammed onto my shoulders, stronger this time. I felt my knees buckle, and my vision blurred at the edges. I tried to yell for help, but my voice wouldn't emerge. It was as if I were locked in a vacuum where my lungs couldn't push out any sound. My arms tingled with an electrifying numbness. My entire body shook with adrenaline. Yet no part of me would respond to my commands. Somehow, I managed to remain upright, although doubled over. My vision spun, and black spots danced across my field of view. The pressure only lasted a few seconds, but they were the longest seconds of my life. When it released me, I staggered back, nearly toppling onto the gurney. My head felt light, and the corridor tilted again in that horrible, dreamlike way. Adrenaline propelled me away from that hallway. My heart throbbed, and hot tears stung my eyes. I burst into the nurse's station, scanning the brightly lit area. It was quiet, with only the low hum of monitors and the shuffle of paperwork in the background. For a moment, relief washed over me. Normalcy still existed here. My breathing was ragged, but I was finally away from the flickering corridor and its crushing, unseen presence. I didn't clock out early. Instead, I forced myself to endure the rest of the shift, clinging to the busier areas of the clinic where the lights shone steadily. Paranoia gnawed at me. Each time I walked a new corridor, a prickling fear coursed through my veins. Whenever I turned a corner, I expected that force to return and pin me again. My body ached from tension, and I felt feverish, drained, yet hyper-alert. By morning, I was a trembling wreck. The sun's first rays illuminated the lobby's glass doors, casting long shadows that might have been comforting under normal circumstances. Instead, they only reminded me of how those corridors had toyed with my senses all night. I left that day with my nerves frayed, my throat dry, and my hands still shaking. Even now, the memory of that crushing weight haunts me. I close my eyes and feel it pressing down, reminding me that some things defy explanation. Part of me wonders if it was just stress, some brutal trick of my overstimulated mind. Yet another part of me remains convinced Something malevolent roams those corridors when no one else is watching. It hides in the flicker of failing lights, waiting for the right moment to show its power. And every time I step through those clinic doors for my next shift, I feel it lurking in the periphery of my vision, ready to push me into a terror I can never quite escape. I felt it the instant I stepped over the threshold, a silent pressure bearing down on my chest, as though the stale air were thick enough to smother my heartbeat. My uncle's workshop looked ordinary at first glance. Rows of metal shelves, a worn-out workbench, and the lingering odor of industrial grease. Yet something in the dim light made the steel tools glint like unfriendly eyes. It was as if the entire space exhaled a warning, telling me I had no place there. A single exposed bulb flickered overhead, casting twitchy shadows across the concrete floor. My pulse quickened before I even realized I was afraid. He had given me permission to store my recently purchased tools in the old workshop, saying it would save me from the expense of renting a storage unit. I remember nodding, grateful for the favor, but I couldn't ignore the subtle hesitation in his voice when he mentioned it was best not to visit after dark. At the time, I assumed he was just being cautious, citing poor lighting and general neglect. After all, no one had used that space in years, and the heavy silence felt like proof of its abandonment. But from the moment I started bringing in my gear, that uneasy feeling crept up my spine and wouldn't let go. The first few days were uneventful, just me organizing wrenches, drills, and extension cords. I thought the place felt cold and lifeless, but not exactly threatening. Then, one night, I heard metal clattering across the floor. I had been inside my car, ready to drive off, when the clanging echoed from behind those battered wooden doors. Heart pounding, I grabbed a flashlight and rushed back, expecting to find scattered bolts or a toppled box. Instead, I found everything exactly as I'd left it. Not a single screw out of place. My skin crawled with an inexplicable dread. I double-checked every corner, opening drawers, peering under the workbench. Nothing. Yet the sharp echo of metal crashing still reverberated in my mind. After that, the noises came more frequently. Always at night. Always just when I thought I was done for the day. I grew jumpy and started avoiding late visits, but I still needed to retrieve tools sometimes, which forced me to confront the workshop's odd hush. I'd unlock the door, and a stale breeze would greet me. My muscles would tighten, bracing for a sound that might not come. Often it didn't, leaving me almost disappointed by the ominous quiet. Each time I turned to leave, I felt as if someone, or something, stood behind me, watching, waiting. But when I'd spin around, the only thing I ever caught sight of was my own trembling shadow. One late afternoon, just as the sun was dipping low, I arrived to pack some boxes for a project. The place felt even more silent than usual, as if the walls themselves held their breath. Then I noticed the old lathe in the corner, a monstrous hunk of iron and steel my uncle used in his prime, was running. Its spindle spun slowly, the hum deep and rhythmic, even though every other light in the workshop flickered with that weak, jaundiced glow. I approached it with caution, heart pounding like a hammer in my chest. Something was off. The machine shouldn't have power. I hadn't turned it on, and I knew the electrical wiring was unreliable. Against my better judgment, I reached for the power cable. My mouth went dry as I realized it was unplugged. A wave of cold sweat drenched my back. That lathe continued to rotate with a lazy, unsettling motion, as if taunting me with an impossible reality. My head swam with confusion,
and a flicker of fear that maybe I was losing my mind. Eventually, I managed to push the power switch to the off position. The spinning slowed, and the machine hissed to a stop. Yet the notion of something intangible lurking in the darkness grew stronger. I felt watched, as though an invisible gaze followed every panicked breath I took. From that moment on, my visits became plagued by an oppressive sense of dread.
Each time I stepped inside, my heartbeat thundered in my ears, and my hands trembled so severely I struggled to do simple tasks like tightening a bolt. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision. A sour taste coated my tongue whenever I stood in the center of that vast emptiness, convinced I saw movement in my peripheral view. I tried to tell myself it was just my overactive imagination, triggered by stress or the strangeness of the place. But a deepening paranoia told me otherwise. I started to suspect the workshop was feeding on my fear, twisting my perception until nothing felt real. I confided in a neighbor once, describing strange noises and tools misplaced in ways that made no logical sense. He simply shrugged, muttering that old places sometimes play tricks on the mind. I couldn't articulate the suffocating tension, the sense of an unseen presence that bristled with malevolence. Words failed to convey how every squeak of metal, every flicker of fluorescent light, made my lungs tighten as if I were drowning in alarm. Even the air smelled wrong, heavy and metallic, laced with a sour undercurrent that reminded me of rotting machinery. Then came the worst night of all. I went to retrieve a missing socket wrench around dusk, determined to be quick. As soon as I stepped inside, the hair on my arms prickled upright. The overhead light sputtered, painting the interior in a sickly strobe effect. My chest felt tight, and my breaths turned shallow. I paused, fully aware of an unnatural hush. The moment I flipped on my flashlight, I caught sight of the lathe spinning again. Only this time, a deep scraping sound accompanied it. My throat constricted in raw terror, and a tremor started in my knees. I forced myself forward, convinced I had to prove it was some faulty wiring or a mechanical glitch. When I reached the machine, I felt something breeze past my left shoulder, cold and heavy, like a tangible gust of malevolent air. My heart thundered so hard that my vision blurred. I swallowed a scream and groped for the lathe switch, stumbling as an unidentifiable shape flickered in the periphery. My palms were clammy, and the handle felt slick beneath my touch. The machine fought me, or so it seemed, as though a presence wanted it to keep spinning. After a pulse-pounding struggle, it finally ground to a halt, and the stuttering light overhead made the scene feel like some nightmarish slideshow. I stood there, pulse raging, convinced I'd crossed into a territory not meant for me. My mind churned with questions. Was this an actual haunting? Or was I unraveling under pressure? I could almost feel a silent laughter in the stale air, like the workshop itself mocked my confusion. My skin tingled with a prickly heat, and I realized my fear had graduated from unease to outright terror. In that suffocating moment, I resolved I would never come back alone. If I had any sense left, I wouldn't return at all. I snatched my wrench, backed away from the lathe, and nearly sprinted for the exit. With the door half open, I thought I saw a ripple in the corner of my eye, like a looming silhouette where no one should stand. My lungs seized as if refusing to draw another breath in that tainted space. I slammed the door shut and fumbled with the lock, every muscle in my body trembling. Outside, the evening air felt agonizingly cold, but it was a relief compared to the suffocating atmosphere within. I could almost taste my own adrenaline as I drove off. The idea of returning made my stomach churn, yet my new tools remained inside. Rational thought told me I was being foolish, that unexplained events often have mundane explanations, but the unmistakable sensation of a gaze tracking my every move refused to leave me. Even at home, I couldn't sleep. My heart thudded like a war drum long into the night. Every time I closed my eyes, I envisioned that lathe spinning in the darkness, powered by something far beyond reason. I haven't stepped foot in that workshop since. I made excuses, telling my uncle I was busy, or that I preferred to keep my tools in my garage for convenience. Part of me worries what lurks in that stale, echoing space, though another part wonders if I simply carried my fear in with me. Either way, I can't shake the feeling that I narrowly escaped something alive yet not alive, feeding on dread, thriving in isolation. Whenever I drive past that building, my heart rate spikes and a chill creeps through my veins. I know I'll never truly be free of that place. It's lodged somewhere deep inside me, like a nightmare that refuses to fade with daylight. And to this day, whenever a piece of metal falls or a tool clinks unexpectedly, my skin goes cold with the memory of that slow spinning lathe, turning in the gloom for no earthly reason.